Hello, my name's Chris Boson. I'm the president of Tiber Creek Associates of Capitol Hill. I'm a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. I know I don't probably look like a lobbyist right now, and there are two good reasons for that. One, it's August, and we're in the middle of the August recess, or as the members call it, the district work period, when most folks just decide to leave Washington because it's too hot and they're tired of one another. Also, part of the reason I don't look like what you probably assume a lobbyist would look like is that there are a lot of different kinds of lobbyists. I'm not the suit-wearing, private jet-flying, corporate kind of lobbyist. I do a lot of work in low-income housing, particularly in tribal communities with senior citizens and with healthcare as well. So it's August and I don't have to shave and I don't have to put on a tie on, but I always look kind of like the dude from The Big Lebowski anyway. I want to talk a little bit about what a lobbyist is, how I do my job, and a little bit about why we have such a bad reputation. And as I like to say, 90% of lobbyists give the other 10% of us a bad name. A lobbyist has a specific legal definition in the United States, but a lobbyist really is just someone whose job it is to try to change government policy, to create a new policy, to end a policy, to amend a policy, whether that's writing a new law, whether that's changing a regulation, or just getting the government to behave in a different way. In the United States, we also have a specific legal definition, and that's someone who spends a certain amount of their workday, I think it's 10%, and a certain percent of the income they earned, influencing the government. So at that point, you become what we refer to as a registered lobbyist, and you're subject to reporting requirements and limitations. But lobbying is something that actually, despite the negative reputation that we have, is actually enshrined in our Constitution. The Article 1, which is part of our Bill of Rights, is famous for guaranteeing the right of free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. But it also has a very important provision that says that Congress can make no law restricting the rights of citizens to lobby. That's not the words that they use. What they say is petition government for redress of grievances. But because it was so important for us to have that people could go and complain to the government because there were limitations on that under the old British system, which I'm sure you guys don't have anymore. There are about 10,000 registered lobbyists in the United States. Those are folks that acknowledge they're lobbyists, spend a significant amount of time on it. But there are, depending on the estimates, probably about 130 to 150,000 people who work in government relations of some form. So very few of us are registered lobbyists. And we also, of course, have that negative association with the name, so a lot of people don't say, I'm a lobbyist. They'll say, oh, I'm involved in strategic communications, or I do government affairs. Because lobbying has a very, very negative connotation. The reason for that is because it's easy to blame lobbyists for problems in the Congress. They can always turn around and say, well, the problem is the lobbyist. My counter argument is I don't actually vote. I don't vote in the Congress, of course. I vote for president and so forth. But if there's a bad law because of the lobbyists, it's because the Congress listened. And whether they were subject to a clever argument or campaign contributions, ultimately it's still the Congress that has to make those decisions and actively vote. So if there are bad laws and lobbyists are getting blamed, it's probably because there's some members of Congress who don't want to take responsibility. I want to talk a little bit about what my daily work is like and how I do it. These days, of course, in COVID, I spend most of my days in a t-shirt, either at home or a small office that I have near the Capitol, but I work by myself, so it's not really a problem. My daily routine involves waking up and doing a lot of reading. I read the Washington Post. Sometimes I read the New York Times. I read the Wall Street Journal. I read local political publications like Roll Call, The Hill. Politico is another very good one that I read a lot of. So I spend a couple hours a day just keeping up with what's happening. Both what's happening from a policy and political standpoint, but what are the rumors? Who's going to run for re-election, who's not, who expects a bill to come up, and who's going to try to oppose a bill. Because all of the things that go on in politics can affect my work in some way, whether it's because somebody lost their election or there have been changes in leadership and so forth. That affects my ability to get my work done. After I do all of that reading, I also will usually study the congressional record if the Congress is in session. Have there been any bills introduced? Have there been any amendments filed? Is there any legislation that's going to move? In a given Congress, and each Congress in the United States, since we have fixed terms, is 2 years. So the first Congress goes back to the 18th century, and now I think we're in the 116th, 117th? I'd have to look that up. But it's a 2-year period. So in a 2-year period, you've got usually 7,000 to 8,000 bills that are going to be introduced. And that's because any member of the House of Representatives and there are 435, or any member of the Senate, and there are 100, can introduce a bill on any topic at any time. Most of them don't pass. In fact, most of the time, no one expects them to pass. They're for messaging purposes. They're to put something out there so you can make a statement. I introduced a bill, or we voted for a bill, or we supported or opposed a bill. So out of that 7,000 or 8,000 bills that are introduced every Congress, about 1.5% to 2% ever become law. And about half of those are just naming a post office somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So that means that a lot of what I do is try to separate from an information standpoint the wheat from the chaff. What's relevant information, what's important for me and my clients, and what is just noise that somebody's talking about in Washington. And let's face it, in politics, whether Washington or anywhere, it's mostly just noise. So I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on with that. I do, in the old days, I would anyway, spend a lot of time going to fundraisers. It's always controversial when it comes to spending money on politics, but I did a lot of that. A lot of getting together with folks, having a beer, talking about something with staff. All these folks, the 535 elected members, all have staffs, and if they're important members that are on important committees or chairs of important committees or have committee staff, then oftentimes I'm getting to know their staff as well. And having been in Washington for 30 years, I've gotten to know a lot of these people, so I already have those relationships. That, of course, has changed now very dramatically. We don't get together to do anything. We do a lot of Zoom calls. We do a lot of emails, but there's none of the in-person kind of lobbying that goes on. And that's positive and negative. It's probably good for my liver that I'm not going out that much, but it is hard to make the relationships, and it's very difficult to have a real conversation with somebody when you're trying to do it like this on a video call. It's just bizarre. But we still do those. We do fundraisers, and it's probably something I should address. Money in politics in Washington is very controversial. The law says that a person can give, as long as you're a U.S. resident, a U.S. citizen, no foreign nationals, no corporations, can make contributions to candidates up to $2,800 per cycle. So if that's a House member, it's a 2-year cycle. If it's a senator, it's a 6-year cycle. And of course, you can give both for the primary election, which is when a party decides who the nominee is going to be, and then you can do it for the general election as well. We also have political action committees. Of course, those can take up to $5,000, but they're becoming less important. Then we have something called a super PAC, which is money that's not specifically connected to a campaign, and it can't be coordinated with the campaign. But the money can be spent on behalf of an issue or on behalf of a candidate as long as there's no coordination. And that's the most controversial right now because there's no limitation. I don't deal with super PACs, very familiar with them. I do occasionally work with PACs. But like I said, a normal PAC at $5,000, now that individual contributions are up to $2,800, doesn't make a big difference. It is illegal for a congressman or a senator or anybody to trade contributions for official action. And there have some that have been caught doing it and have gotten in an awful lot of trouble. Either, I don't know if any of them have gone to jail, but certainly a lot have lost their office and so forth. But it does provide access. Now, having lobbied, since I lobby in the low-income housing world, I don't often have that kind of access. When I'm working for a bigger company, maybe like a nursing home company, then I can have contributions backing it up and I can have meetings. The money is very useful for access. Like I said, making connections with staff and members. If you go to a fundraiser and they're there, then you get to talk to them. It would be illegal and actually pretty stupid for a member to suddenly say, well, I got a $1,000 contribution, I'm going to change my mind. But it makes a difference if you're in the room making the argument. There have been a lot of proposals on how you limit contributions and their influence in elections, and we have a challenge here because we have the First Amendment, which says that you can say anything you want. I referenced that before when I talked about being a lobbyist. But it's very difficult in our system to say, all right, well, you're not allowed to talk now. That would violate the Constitution. So it's a very complicated issue, and it's one that none of us are very happy with. I would be fine if there weren't contributions involved in it. I think I could still be an effective lobbyist, but as long as they're out there, sometimes I have to have access to members, so we use those. It's very unfortunate. I did want to give a quick example, since I've been talking about how I do these things, of what's going on right now, and it's relevant to the COVID situation, so maybe this will help explain it. One of the things I do a lot of work with is the long-term care industry. That means nursing homes, convalescent care homes, that sort of thing. So that is obviously a difficult environment to be in right now because of the prevalence of COVID and the vulnerability of the population in long-term care facilities. So back in March, when the whole world was sort of coming to a stop, the long-term care facilities that I work with were saying, well, we've got some real problems. We're not sure what this is going to cost, what staffing is going to cost. We need to get more PPEs, the personal protective equipment, need to make changes in how we staff, changes in how the buildings physically operate and so forth. And so that, of course, becomes a big question for money. And there was a lot of money put into long-term care in these COVID response bills, trillions of dollars going out, a lot of that going to the healthcare industry. In our case, we're looking at folks that have borrowed through a government program and needed some flexibility. That there's a government program we identified back in March and said, look, if you change the statute a little bit, if you change the law, these facilities would actually be able to borrow money very quickly. They wouldn't have to pay it back immediately, and they'd be able to take care of some of these problems that aren't being covered by some of the grant programs. And it was a way we came up with it that wouldn't actually cost money to the government. Now, of course, since this is the government we're dealing with, the mere fact that we have a good idea that would make a lot of sense doesn't mean the government's going to do it. First of all, government doesn't always make good choices and good decisions, which is why I have a job. But also, under normal circumstances, they're inundated with a lot of ideas. During COVID, they're overwhelmed because everybody has a way to solve this or do that, and some of the ideas are good and some of them are bad, and some of them are genuinely helpful and some of them are going to personally enrich someone. So we had to go through a long process of trying to convince folks that this was a good policy idea. First, we started with the government agency itself. It's the Federal Housing Administration. They do the financing for these, and so we talked to them, got some support. And then we had to come up with legislative language. How would we write the law so that it would enable facilities to access this money? So in that case, I actually had to write a draft of the law because it takes the government attorneys months, sometimes years, to figure out the best way to do it, and we needed to move quickly. So I did a draft. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been in the business long enough that I can kind of fake it. So I faked some language. We had the unofficial blessing from the agency, and we went to Congress and said, look, you need to change this law. And this will make a big difference. There was a bill we tried to get the provision onto that went out of the House of Representatives. We were not included in that. It was largely a messaging bill. So it went over to the United States Senate. Now, my clients I represent are mostly in the states of Maryland, Texas, Arkansas, some in Colorado, Nevada. But the person who was most influential was the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, because this would be a program that falls under his jurisdiction, and he's a senator by the name of Mr. Crapo. He's from Idaho in the upper Northwest. We didn't have any facilities up there, so we're not constituents. And once again, it doesn't matter if I have campaign contributions. If my issues aren't relevant to the constituents of a member, they're really not going to care. But since we didn't have any, we found a partner, somebody else that's involved in the long-term care industry that had a similar issue. So we started working together. We started working with the National Trade Association for Nursing Homes, all while trying to simply convince Congress of an idea that everybody thinks is pretty good. So we went through that process for months. We finally got some traction. Senator Crapo supported the idea. Members of his committee supported the idea. And then for complicated, unrelated political machinations, all of that came to a screeching halt because a different committee started to take over. Now suddenly, rather than working with Senator Crapo from Northwest United States and Idaho, we have to work with Senator Collins, who's from the Northeastern United States and Maine. So we had to shift very quickly. And that was an example of why I have to spend so much time reading and being aware of what's going on with members, who's got an election, what's happening, because these things can change so quickly. So this whole group, the trade associations, the long-term care companies, the staffers we've been working with, all shifted our effort immediately to the Appropriations Committee to try to get this done. So we spent about 3 weeks, probably doing 12, 14 hours a day. And then the whole thing stopped. Negotiations ended between the White House and the House and the Senate, and they decided to leave for the August recess without having resolved it. So 6 months of work on a project that just about everybody says, well, that makes sense, we should do that, all came to a grinding halt. And now we're in the August recess and nothing's happening because the members have either gone home or gone to the conventions or whatever else they're doing. So we'll get to September and we'll start this process again. If we're lucky and we work hard enough, then maybe we help the nursing homes and some of them stay in business that might otherwise not, and there's less disruption to patients, but who knows? And honestly, there's nothing for me to do right now except try to relax and gather my strength, and when September comes, I'll shave my beard off and try to look like a real lobbyist again. I hope I didn't bore you too much. If you have any questions, I'd obviously be more than happy to answer them, but we're not going to be doing it over the video. So if you want to talk to the folks and get my email, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I hope this is the only time I do a video like this, because it's much nicer to talking to students in person. But anyway, that's what being a lobbyist is like in Washington today.